recording notification.
Hi all, I'm Meredith Jacob, and I'm at American University Washington College of Law, and work there on issues on Creative Commons, copyright, open licensing, and new technology. And I'm going to let my co-presenters introduce themselves. Will?
Thanks, Meredith. So, hey, everybody, I'm Will. I direct a thing called the Open Knowledge Center at North Carolina State University, and I've weaseled my way into getting to work with Meredith on a lot of different projects in different ways. Basically, what that means is I'm the lawyer in the libraries, and I get to do a lot of the fun open stuff, including this Code of Best Practice and Fair Use for OER that we're going to be talking about. And it's really a pleasure to work with such cool folks that are on the call and to have this great conversation with you all today. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. You're right below me in the little Brady Bunch screen, so I'll pass it to you.
I'm actually going to go to Amber next.
Okay, thanks Shannon and Will and Meredith. My name's Amber Hoyt and I'm the director of the World Languages Resource Center at Boise State. I come from an instructional design background and I support open projects both within the context of world languages and also lots of different open initiatives at Boise State and in the state of Idaho. And now I'm turning it back to you, Shannon.
Hi, everybody. A lot of you know me, I think. I'm Shannon Smith. I'm the Student Success Librarian at University of Wyoming. I partially did that for some context into how Amber and I know each other. My previous position was Open Educational Resources Librarian at Boise State University, and working with her on some projects is what brought me into the space with thinking about fair use more deeply with OER and Meredith and Will.
Thanks. So just to give everybody a big picture of what we are going to talk about today. A couple of years ago, Will and Peter Jaszi and Prue Adler and I released the Code of Best Practices in Fair Use, the Code of Best Practices in Fair Use for OER. There are a number of them. We're used to talking about this one, but I should contextualize that. And that Code of Best Practices was a way for folks to understand sort of when and how they could incorporate existing copyrighted stuff from out there in the real world. Quotes, clips, excerpts, photos, poems, videos, music into their OER. And what we had done, though, is we'd created this document that we were really proud of. We'd thought a lot about it. We'd argued about each sentence. And then we realized that, in fact, creating a platonically perfect document didn't do very much if you didn't help people understand what it was or how to use it. And so we worked with folks like Amber and Shannon and some groups we've worked with also this year at the National Council of Teachers of English, at a OER program in Maine called Moose. And we've worked with them to say, okay, we have this document. It is undisputably perfect, but it's possible that we need to work with folks to understand what the sort of more abstract ideas in the code mean in different specific discipline fields of teaching. Because if we talk about something that we'll do later, talking about using something for critique, what critique means if you are teaching early grade reading versus what critique means if you are teaching chemistry versus what critique means if you are teaching French feels really different. And that if we wanted this to actually change practice, that we had to do something about that. Man, the next slide, Will. Just kidding, no slides. It's cool. I know what the slides say, you will soon. So the reason we got into this work is the experiences, I think, that Will and I, the next one too, that Will and I had talking to folks about OER. So we had gone out into the world, gone to conferences like this back when it was in person, and we talked to people a lot about how the Creative Commons licenses work and about how they enabled you to make and share these open educational resources. And because it was a really polite group of folks, they would sit politely, they would nod, and then all of the questions in the end were about other stuff. Because the truth is, after you've worked with CC licenses for a while, they're relatively straightforward. There might be some edge questions about remixing two different things or about a new use, but basically once you've used the CC licenses to create and use OER for a year or two, you got most of the big pieces, right? There's a lot of information out there. But in fact, the questions we got were about interacting with all sorts of other valuable stuff, because you can't really create good OER and, do good pedagogy if you are just sort of sitting in your closed room, only operating in the world of what you know in your brain and what is already under an open license. So there's all this other stuff out there, ideas, ways to do stuff, texts, primary sources that you have to interact with to do a good job of teaching. And we got a ton of questions about those, about using outside sources, about using ideas, about using methods. And I think what felt so urgent is that this stuff felt really hard and risky to folks in the OER community. But from a copyright standpoint, this was some of the sort of easiest sort of core questions to answer. These were some of the easiest core questions to answer, because copyright law is intentionally designed to have in it a balance of protecting copyright enough that people make stuff, but having real limits and exceptions and boundaries to that, so that the stuff they make can get out there and inform the world and teach people and sort of be built upon. And so we were talking to folks both in those sessions and then in the context of the best practices about 3 big buckets of stuff that can go into your OER. The first is things that are in the public domain, which is works not protected by copyright because they were created too long ago, right? Works that have aged into the public domain. The second thing we have is stuff that's not eligible because of sort of special rules. So like things created by federal government employees in the course of their employment. So all the stuff created by federal agencies, by the agencies themselves, is not protected by copyright. And then the third, and in some ways the biggest invisible part of that, is ideas. Ideas are not protectable by copyright. Even good ideas, even new ideas, even valuable ideas are not protected. It may be really important in your discipline, depending on the type of work you're doing in your scholarship, to cite where those ideas came from, but they are not protected by copyright. The second big bucket you guys are all familiar with is Creative Commons work. So stuff where you've read the license, you follow the license, you can do what you want. The third big bucket, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today, is things that are permitted by limitations and exceptions to copyright. In the United States, the primary one of those that you're going to hear about is fair use. We are going to talk about fair use throughout the talk today. In fact, though, every country has a structure of limitations and exceptions to copyright. In Canada, they have fair dealing. And as it says in the 3rd appendix to the code, possibly the 4th appendix to the code was written by lawyers. In the 4th appendix to the code, we talk a lot about how, in fact, Canadian fair dealing law and US fair use law are almost exactly overlapping in this area of educational fair use and fair dealing. But other countries that don't have fair dealing also have limitations in their law to allow critique, quotation, private study, for education, for libraries. They have these in their law. And so the stuff we're talking about here, while it is technically US specific in this code, it applies, I think, in almost exactly the same way to Canadian law, and will apply in some substantive ways to other countries as well. I'm going to take a pause here. We've got a lot to go through. We have a lot of slides, but I don't want folks to just listen. We have a question box in the functionality of the Zoom call, but also if anyone has any questions about this sort of basic idea that when you're creating OER, you can bring in works from the public domain, ideas from the public domain, you can bring in CC stuff, but you can also bring things in under fair use. Does anyone have any questions about that? As you go, please do drop in questions. We're going to try to pause throughout the talk and take questions so that we don't get to the end and have to sort of page all the way back. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about why you can rely on fair use, why the structure of the law is meant to allow you to bring things in. But often I think people who work in education, teaching in libraries and in higher education feel what is probably understandable, but not particularly fact-based, high risk about copyright and about sort of bringing things in fair use. And I think it's because a combination of sort of a hangover from the Grokster, Napster movie industry cases that are really about big, intentional, knowing large-scale copyright infringement. Those people didn't have a fair use theory. They were just making copies because they didn't want to pay, which is a different thing than fair use. And then I think separately, and this is really important, I think particularly as we start talking about academic practice, attribution, copyright, and artificial intelligence, is that we have these things that get bound up together, which is norms around plagiarism and attribution and sort of responsible scholarship and modeling careful, responsible scholarship with copyright, which is really an economic thing about do you pay the parking meter or not? And, you know, it's really important to not let those two get bound up together, but they do sometimes. And I think it's made people really hesitant about relying on fair use and about sort of digging into that. And we hope the code makes that easy and it makes it feel safe. But in a bit of a carrot and a stick approach, we are also going to emphasize that there are some big downsides, some really big unavoidable pieces of mission risk if you don't rely on fair use. One is, and I think a lot of these are related, you tend to rely more on linking out. You say, oh, you know, I don't know about this. I'm just gonna link out. And the biggest problem in linking out, I think, is the biggest sort of ethical problem is that you've given away your responsibility to make sure that there is full and equal access for students with disabilities in your cohort. That, you know, what's out there may appear sort of accessible. It may be accessible now, but you're sort of saying, you know, it's not my problem. And so I think, you know, when you bring those things into your materials, it is an excerpt or as a quote, as these inserts that we talk about, you have the ability to control and sort of fully provide that access. The second issue, I think, is sort of mission risk, where you make pedagogical choices based on copyright, not based on your professional choice. You're like, this isn't the best, most engaging thing, but it's here under an open license, so it's good enough, right? And I think that that's not sort of reasonable given what we will hopefully explain, the in fact really, really, really low, almost non-existent risk around relying on fair use. Another thing I think is that there are a couple of different ways that it has a negative impact on marginalized student populations. One is that OER is a sort of narrow slice of what's available, that you might want to bring in materials that are that feel authentic and feel representative of your students' experience. And you can say, well, you know, but there's this openly licensed version, I'll use that instead. The other, I think, is often not relying on fair use may mean relying on subscription-based or other sort of authenticated materials. And for students who have unreliable internet access or are logging in from multiple devices, I think everything that is behind a paywall, you have a slight risk of not having sort of full and equal access. So those are reasons that we think, even though there's sort of a step up to understanding fair use, that we think we can help you do it. We have some good examples from Shannon and Amber about how it's helped them in practice, and that it's worth doing because it helps you have better pedagogy, more equity in terms of access for students, both students with diagnosed disabilities, but also students who can just use more flexible formats, and then also having sort of more authentic voices and equal access for marginalized students. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand this over to Will to talk about the code of best practices in fair use in OER. But as I do, I would just want to sort of contextualize all this, which is to say, I think thinking about copyright in the sort of full universe of creating and owning educational materials is going to be part of understanding what our negotiating position is as we go into these big questions about subscription services, about AI tools, and that sort of having, whether or not you sort of make these choices, understanding the baseline about the different buckets of sort of copyright and control are going to be one of the few ways that we can really have a negotiating position about the terms and reasons we use subscription services and the ways in which AI tools for students and for teachers are a part of that. So Will, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, and I'll do my best not to close the slides this time as we hand it over. So thank you, Meredith. Thanks everybody for being here. Like Meredith said, the code comes from sort of a problem that's also an opportunity, which is the need for including materials under fair use and other limitations and exceptions, but also the sort of disconnect between the capacious welcoming arms that copyright law presents to educators and the perceived risk or uncertainty or like that feels really scary to me that you often heard on the ground. And so what we did in creating this code is similar to what's been done when we created other code, which is that we talked to a lot of people in the field. We did interviews and focus groups and just said, hey, open educators, how do you think about making great open materials? What are the best practices pedagogically? What are the things that get you excited? What are the missed opportunities, the things you wish you could do if only it didn't seem like copyright was so in the way in different ways? And we had, I don't remember the final number, but it was in the hundreds for sure of people that we talked to just ask those questions. We gathered them up, we synthesized their materials, and then we created a set of this code of best practice. And then a really, really important step, we vetted it with a bunch of independent folks, a bunch of other legal experts in the field. And I don't think we have that list here. But we vetted it with all those folks and basically said, can you check our work? We think this makes sense. We think this reflects the state of the law and the state of play. But if we're playing fast and loose with the rules, if we're saying something that's not right, please push back on it. And it was just an incredible group of folks, both from sort of the library copyright space, the legal academic copyright space, and so forth. And to a person, they had some little suggestions around the edges, but the number one comment we got was essentially, this doesn't go as far as it could. This is a pretty centrist, conservative, middle-of-the-road document. You could probably push even further here. And we said, we know that, and we hear that loud and clear. We want to make sure that we can say to people when we talk about the code, this is the safe, easy, middle ground stuff. And I say that, one, to reassure you if you're going like, yeah, maybe this is what I can get away with, but is it really okay? Yeah, this is the easy, bland, boring, can I drive at the green light, not at the yellow light stuff. But also to say this isn't the edge of the map in terms of the stuff that you can do. We're mapping out the big, easy stuff here, but if you don't, in this set of principles that we're going to articulate in a second, see the stuff that you're thinking about, that doesn't mean the answer is no. That doesn't mean the answer is even like controversial and yes. This is just the number one set of people told us this is really important pedagogically. And copyright law says, yes, absolutely, please do that. That's what the system wants you to be doing as a sort of set of legal incentives. So the document, and thank you for sharing that in the chat, Emily, is it documents a bunch of different things, but the sort of the heart of it are these set of principles in the middle where we offer up a use case. Educators want to be able to do this. A statement of principle, and they can do that. And then a set of considerations. As you're doing that, think about these things. Don't forget about attribution. Don't forget about, drawing on different sources and that sort of thing. And then as sort of an outer limit, a set of hard cases, a set of, this is the safe space. If you're starting to walk over in this direction, you're not in trouble, but watch your footing a little bit more and make sure you're really centering pedagogy and centering the stuff that you should be centering in different ways. So I'll give sort of a quick overview of those 4 principles. This is, as Meredith said, a great time to ask questions at any point. So if we say something about the first principle that makes you go, wait, I want to know more about that, or I'm confused about this piece of it, drop that in the Q&A feature and we'll be happy to answer it there. And then we're going to do our level best to leave some time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So 4 big principles articulated in the code, 4 big things that educators could and should and hopefully are doing that copyright law absolutely clearly supports. The first is, I think if you made a list sort of numerically of the items that educators said were important to them, I think this would be at the top of the list. And that made us smile because this is, if this was a law school exam, it would be the shortest, easiest law school exam in the world. Under copyright law, is it okay to include inserts, third-party materials included under fair use, as object of criticism and commentary? Yes, of course, absolutely. That's core bedrock foundation use stuff right there. So the example we have here is including a poem in a textbook about poetry and saying, here, students, here's an example of a certain kind of poem. Let's do a close reading and a critique of it. Maybe the professor will do that directly and say, here, I'm gonna mark it up and annotate it and say, this is a great example of this poetic device done well. This is not as successful, etc. But there could also be cases where the instructor says, here, students, here's a poem. I'm going to invite you to do that critique and create that commentary and so forth as well. So this is, again, an easy slam dunk, no problem. Copyright law supports this sort of work. And that's the first principle articulated in the code, critique and commentary. The second principle is sort of a close cousin of that first principle. It again deals with bringing in an insert for engagement, but in this case, it's about illustration rather than critique or commentary. So in this example that I'm showing here, I'm imagining a textbook about media and representation in media, and we want to have a section on the depiction of robots and artificial intelligence and androids in popular media. And I say there's been a through line throughout this, and I want to illustrate the through line. Here's an example of this from Metropolis, this movie from 1927, and here's another example from a newer film. I'm illustrating how similar those things are. Here, you can see this through line. You can see that connection. In a textbook, I could just say, there are often similarities in the depiction of robots in movies. For example, they're often metal and have rounded heads or whatever, but it's much more effective pedagogically to show this example and say, here, I'm illustrating my point through inclusion of this sort of material. This is, again, just as easy a yes from a copyright standpoint, and just as, I think, critical a practice for a lot of educators. So there's the second principle, illustration. The third principle we talked about is a little bit different, and this is a nice example of one that comes up in really different ways in different contexts, but I think it's pedagogically really, really rich, fertile soil to be working in. That third principle deals with incorporating content as learning resource materials. The example that we've got here pulls from a lot of our conversations that we had with folks who are in language learning communities. And what they said to us over and over was, if I'm trying to teach somebody how to speak a language that's new to them, I can give them the sort of silly, stale, made up textbook examples, je m'appelle Will, je vous ai, whatever, right? But it's much, much better to say, this is how people actually speak the language in the real world. So if you were creating a textbook on the languages spoken in Brazil, you might make up a bad generic, Will example, but you might also say, here's a telenovela. Here, do you hear how people from different positionalities in society and in different relationships and contexts are using the language in different way? There's no substitute for the real thing in its real context. And I know Amber and Shannon are going to offer us an example of that in a few minutes as well. So those first three were probably the 1, 2, and 3 list there: critique and commentary, illustration, and incorporating content as learning resource materials. The fourth principle is sort of an odd duck, but it's one we think is pretty important, so we wanted to include it and underline it here as well. And this principle is repurposing existing pedagogical content from existing educational materials. And this is a sensitive one, right? Because the number one no answer that you tend to give when you're talking about copyright is like, I want to make a history textbook. Can I take 2 existing all rights reserved closed textbooks and smush them together? And like, no, that's not transformative in the way the code talks about. But there are cases where, because of market failures, because of that expression idea that Meredith talked about a moment ago, and in other cases, there are opportunities where you don't have to reinvent the wheel, where you can take existing resources from pedagogical content, textbooks and similar, and incorporate them. And we got 2 nice examples here. The first example on the left, I really like this one. This is a book on modern nuclear technology from, judging by the cover, 1968 or so. If I were learning modern nuclear technology, I might not want to learn from a textbook that was 40 or 50 years old. Things might have changed in nuclear technology, and you don't want to get that one wrong. But if this is a work that has been out of commerce and out of print for 40 years, it doesn't really exist in the market, there are going to be opportunities to sort of draw from and build on that in different ways simply because it's out of commerce. More than that, though, the stuff you can pull from any of those resources are things like the example on the right, this list of verb tenses. There's a lot of information here in this Spanish verb tenses, but most of it is not subject to copyright. In fact, I'll say just about all of it is not subject to copyright. As Meredith talked about, facts and ideas and words and short phrases aren't protectable. So the fact that verb tenses are presented in the sort of standardized order, that these are the endings that you use and that sort of thing, that's just not protectable. So if you're making your own Spanish textbook, you don't have to reinvent the wheel and find your own unique, original, never before thought of way to present verb tenses. You can just borrow the existing established way. And in fact, it would be a lesser textbook if you made up Will's new, non-intuitive, not accepted by the community way of talking about verb tenses. So that's your fourth example. So commentary and critique, illustration, real world stuff, and then repurposing existing content in these contexts that I've talked about so far. Meredith, you've done a great job keeping a straight face. Is there anything you want to jump in and insert and make sure we don't miss?
No, you've done a great job. I was very, very happily reading the questions, and I was going to suggest that I think we might have one more slide on these, but then before we pass it over to Shannon and Amber to talk about their specific case, that we might answer a few of the questions about the code itself.
That sounds perfect. Thank you. So yeah, as Meredith mentioned, there's this set of appendices that are not those 4 principles, but they're really, really critical. So we wanted to point to them briefly. First, there's sort of an overview of our findings and a concise account of fair use law. So if you're going, what is this fair use thing? I want to get the basics before I jump into the specifics. That's a really, really good resource to have at your fingertips for your own learning, and an especially nice resource to be able to give to decision makers and gatekeepers in your institution who go, what is this fair use thing? Is that some nonsense fly-by-night thing that you just made up? Like, no, it's the law, and here's a nice, concise way to understand that. Meredith referred to sections 3 and 4, which speaks to the sort of downstream use question that we heard from a lot of people. This is great for folks working in the United States. I'm in Canada, I'm in London, I'm in Brisbane, or wherever it is. How does this fit in with my work? And the answer, as Meredith said, is most nations in the world have both a policy of supporting education, because education is a public good, and are signatories to something called the Berne Convention that requires a certain amount of harmony in those exceptions and limitations. So Appendix 3 is a sort of an overview of those exceptions around the world, and 4 is a deeper dive by our colleague Karis Craig into the Canadian context that spells out in a really, really thoughtful way the way US and Canadian understanding of copyright exceptions and education dovetail in really, really similar ways. And then finally, 5 is a quick run through. So the other IP doctrines, what about patent? What about trademark? How do I think about that stuff? That information there as well. That's probably about enough of me yammering on. So yeah, Meredith, I'm really excited to get to those questions. I'll open up the chat now, but if there's one that really caught your eye, I'm happy for you to tee us off.
So I'm going to go through the ones in the Q&A box quickly in a sort of hopefully top-down sort of way. So there's a question here that I think is a good sort of threshold question, which is how to deal with the difference between attribution and citation, and how much is sufficient to include when relying on fair use. I think there were 3 different things bound up in there, and it's important to keep them separate. When you were using a CC licensed material and you are relying on that license, you have to provide the citation in the way that the license requests, right? Which is usually title, author, source, license. That is the term of the CC BY license, that you need to do it that way. And you need to do it when you're using the work and relying on a license. The second thing is these sort of attribution and plagiarism and sort of professional standards of whatever discipline you're in and of the thing you're doing, right? Everybody attributes more formally, does citation more formally in an academic article than they do in a textbook, than they do in maybe an essay. It's all, like, that's a professional thing. And you should use the format and location that makes sense. And in that context, we often don't use formal citations. No one, you might not use a formal citation for something that was clearly a quote because it was in quotation marks and it's like a historical quote that you're just using for sort of introductory context. But you might really need to cite new scholarly ideas in your discipline. Fair use is sort of more like that than it is like CC licensing, but it's also important to remember that with fair use, citation is not a legal requirement. It's a requirement in the code because folks felt like it was really important to say where things are. And it's really important if you're creating an openly licensed resource to be clear which is your new stuff that is under that open license and which stuff you're using under fair use. Because that fair use stuff can travel with your OER. Other people, assuming you've done a good job in your fair use analysis and they're using it in your OER, are going to come to the same conclusions. But if they were going to take that apart and use its constituent parts for something else totally different, they could do that with the open license stuff, but they can't with the fair use. So there, it's just really important that a normal reader can tell which stuff is fair use and which stuff is not. And so sometimes that might require a citation and a little footnote that says, this excerpt is included under fair use. sometimes if it's like a short quote where you use quotation marks and you attribute to the author, any reasonable person will know that's fair use and you don't need to mark it. So another question here is about the relationships with the highest level of admin and legal team, who would prefer nobody gets close to the line in any way. So here, the code can be a really useful tool to say, look, I'm not like sitting in my office and like flipping a coin and going like, I don't know, feels like fair use. You're saying, look, this is a code. It was developed at a law school. It's got a lot of careful outside review. One of our reviewers was actually the head of the National Association of College and University General Counsel's Copyright Working Group. Like, you know, these are responsible folks, and hopefully that code can be one of the ways that you say, I'm not doing this on my own. This is actually, you know, very conservative within what the code says. There's a question here asking about, you know, Will was saying this is sort of centrist and asking about sort of what are the edge cases, and those are in the code often. We have cases that are sort of the harder cases. And when we say harder cases, we don't mean polite no. We really mean they're harder, and they're going to depend on both the specifics of the case and, in some ways, having talked to folks in your program and institution and said, look, we've thought about the best practices, we've thought about the law, we've thought about our teaching mission and what we're doing here. We think this is fair use, and we're willing to tolerate somebody coming and writing us a nasty letter or someone just questioning what we're going to do. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in, like, I would say 99%, but that's too low. In like 99.9% of cases, the real risk you are facing is a nasty letter. Because, you know, there's a question here that says, I need a bright line. I can't tolerate any legal risks. But the reality is the legal risk here is very, very low, because in addition to the fair use provision in the law we have talked about, there's a separate part of the law that says if you are an employee of a, you know, not-for-profit educational institution and you do your best good faith fair use analysis and a court later decides you were wrong, you are limited to the actual damages. So they would have to prove that in their non-existent market for excerpts from fiction that, you know, they had lost like, you know, $8.45 for your use of that 3-paragraph excerpt. Also, that is just not a very, so that is both a low consequence and an unlikely thing. So that's sort of the big picture there. Will,
and
just questions in the chat you want to grab?
Yeah, a couple. And I also wanted to follow on to what you just said, which is it's both sort of a low legal risk and financially speaking, because 504c2, which is if I ever get a tattoo, what my tattoo is going to be, says that they remit statutory damages and can only get actual damages. What that means is that what somebody who is suing you could recover is at the maximum that there was a study a few years back that just filing a copyright suit in federal court costs, I think it's about $250,000 or so. So they would have to be balancing, it's going to cost us $250,000 to $300,000 to recover $20.42 or whatever. And that's assuming you're not at a public institution like I am, where there simply isn't liability in the first place.
Yeah.
I saw a question about a sort of a 30% amount, and I always like to talk about that sort of the copyright folklore that's out there. No more than 10 seconds, no more than 20 or 30%, no more than 5 this or that or the other. What that 30% number represents is, generally speaking, the way a particular institution or organization has decided to operationalize the way they do their fair use analysis. It's not in the law itself. It hasn't been recognized by the courts. In fact, a few years back, the Georgia State case that dealt with court reserves specifically rejected all of those sort of guidelines and rules and said that's not the law. Don't bring that into our courtroom. So you may say we need a bright line, so we're going to invent our own number or percent or whatever, but that's not based in the law. And as we all know, those numbers often get in the way of making the right pedagogical choice, right? I can only use 10% of a painting. Okay, is that like the top 10% or like just going to be really low resolution or what? Like it's not aligned with pedagogy, so it's not a very good pedagogical approach, and the law doesn't recognize it, so it's not a very good legal approach either. So you'll hear that folklore sometimes. I want to bust that myth if I can and say that's not the law. That's the way somebody thought it would be useful in a moment for them to think about that stuff. that has sort of grown
Other
legs.
thing I would say is there's this pervasive mythology, I think, outside of just copyright law, that big companies or whoever will sue over anything. And I think it does everybody a disservice. People will write nasty letters over anything, but there are huge downsides to suing because, one, you look evil. Two, if you lose, there is now new law that says you are definitely wrong, right? Like in a lot of situations, it's actually better for folks to just get to write unsubstantiated, nasty letters and sort of not have to engage with that. Because, one of the few cases that we've seen, interestingly, about Creative Commons licensed stuff, which is litigation about printing non-commercial stuff, they very specifically did not sue the school because, as Will says, many public universities and public schools actually are mostly protected from liability, but also it makes them look bad. Those are their clients. And so I think the risk of lawsuits feels really big, but in fact, for a lot of reasons, it is a risk to both sides, right? Neither side is like super excited to get into that. And the other thing we've said is when people have relied on these codes, we have never seen a lawsuit. So the best practices in fair use project is about 20 years old, started with the best practices for documentary filmmakers. There's been about 11 others. And in fact, we have never seen a lawsuit where someone has followed the code and then been sued.
I see two quick, easy yeses, and then I want to hand it over to Shannon and Amber, if that's okay, Meredith? Great,
Yeah,
okay.
totally.
There's a question about the verb tense example and whether you can include existing or whether you need to recreate it. There's no real copyright difference in sort of recreating as close to exactly as you can. So if it's fair use to use the table at all, you can use the original. You don't have to recreate it. The question below is asking whether you can use a copy of the recording of a telenovela, and the answer is yes, absolutely. Again, if it's fair use under the sort of the descriptions in the code, as it very often will be, then the answer to that is yes at all. And then the final question is asking whether there's a difference between doing something in a closed environment like the classroom versus on the open web. And I just wanted to say that the code is designed to support the creation of open resources that sort of are shared into the wider world. So you might say, I feel more confident in the closed constraints of the classroom, or there are other sort of different things that might feel different in that context. But everything we've been talking about is not just for closed behind a paywall or login or whatever, but it's for making open resources that can go and live and flourish everywhere. And there are some other questions that we'll try to get back to as well, but I do want to make sure, Amber and Shannon, you have a chance to talk about what we're really here to talk about, which is the cool stuff you've been doing, not just the background stuff that Meredith and I have sort of set up. So I'm going to mute and run the slides, just say next slide, and I will do my best to actually advance the slides.
Awesome, thank you, Will.
Next slide, Will. We don't have anything to say there. So Amber and I were both part of a language cohort focused on thinking about fair use with language groups. And I do want to give a shout out to Haley Clausen, who's in the room today, that was part of this group with us as well. And for some context with Amber and I, we both have experience collaborating with both pre-service and in-service instructors from post-secondary and secondary institutions. We came to this fair use cohort with the perspectives of an instructional designer and a librarian. Both of our roles contain the aspect of partnering with subject faculty to create and remix OER projects. Our shared question and kind of probably passion thing we come back to all the time in our work is how do we empower instructors who have limited time but really valuable ideas? While we both have experience working with faculty in many different disciplines, in this cohort, it was language learning, especially as how that applies to a French curriculum project. You're going to hear Amber talk mostly about that. I am by no means a language instructor. I was the librarian on the ground here. Next slide, I think, Will.
Yeah. So for a few moments, I'd like to take a step back and just talk a little bit about the project that kind of was the impetus for us to really start using the code on, I would say, almost on a daily basis, right, Shannon? So we have on the right-hand side, you can see 3 screenshots of the Francais Inclusif textbook, which is a curriculum that was revised and remixed from an existing textbook from the University of Texas at Austin. And it was created by a team of 3 K-12 teachers, an instructional designer, myself, who does not speak French, which is very fun. My French is probably on par with Will. Sorry, Will. and that we also had our OER librarian, Shannon, and some university French instructors as well. And we really wanted to create a resource that was more inclusive of the Francophone world and perhaps a little bit more updated with some authentic materials. But one of the things that I think held us back was this idea of how can we use all of this great authentic stuff? Surely it's copyrighted and we're going to get in big trouble. And Will and Meredith, I think, did a great job of introducing that. We haven't gotten in trouble. We're not going to get in trouble, right? Because we've used this code. So in our field of language teaching, authentic materials is a best practice. And it was really key for us to be able to rely on fair use because, as Meredith mentioned, France and Canada have some wonderful resources, but some of the other Francophone speaking places, especially a lot of places in Africa, there might not be a lot of OER out there. And we are really passionate about inclusion and representation and making sure that all of the Francophone world is in our book. And so we've been able to use the code to incorporate lots of wonderful, beautiful, real French speakers into the text. Okay, next slide. So with that, I thought it would be helpful to dive into an example that we actually talked about in the cohort, and it's in our French text as well. And to give you a little bit of information about the assignment, the artifact or the real world thing that we chose to use, which is a clip from a French film, and then also go over the fair use rationale. And Shannon and I are going to do a little bit of popcorning back and forth on that part to kind of give you some practice with the kind of the mindset or the reflection questions you might want to consider. So real briefly, the assignment here was to go over vocabulary, greetings, and introductions, but in a real world context, right? So we'll give a beautiful example of the French that we all probably learned and how you should introduce yourself. And that's not really like what always happens, right? There's many different ways to say hello in French and to greet yourself. And it's gonna really depend on who you're talking to. And so the idea would be that students would have some exposure to this vocabulary before they come to class. And then in class, we would watch the film, The Class, a clip from it, and start to pull apart or dissect some of these questions. Some of the questions include, like, how did the man greet the people he meets outside the school? How do teachers greet one another? Are the greetings and introductions you see in this clip similar to the way that you greet your friends, classmates, and professors? And to really reflect on the way people are interacting with one another and the diversity that is present. So we have the clip and we're going to play maybe 30-40 seconds of it just to give you a little snippet of what it looks like. And before we do that, though, I think it would be helpful for Shannon do you want to break down on we'll go to the next slide, Will. Break down the attribution that we've included here too, so you can kind of see a preview of that.
Yeah, I think Meredith talked about this, and this ties to the question we already had. Amber and I very much use the tassel, title, author, source, license mindset when we're creating any type of attribution, regardless of whether it's under an open license or not. If you want to hear us talk way too much about that, we have a presentation in a little while. But here you can really see that play out with classroom title being classroom greeting, being the title, the information about it, acknowledging the author. And then when we're working in that fair use space and we know something is fully under copyright, we really like to just indicate that we included it under fair use. And that link there is to the code of best practices for fair use in OER. So that if somebody else is using our content, they might not be familiar with that, but they have that code then attached to this fully copyrighted material, and they can think through why we may have included it in this context. So it's just that attribution mindset, but instead of the license really going to the fair use piece. And I kind of think about it as usage rights instead of license.
Awesome. Thanks, Shannon. Will, do you mind playing about 30-40 seconds of the clip, and I can tell you when to stop if that's helpful.
You might need to have the sound come from your computer, Will.
I'm not sure that I know how to do that in Zoom.
Easiest thing to do is to stop sharing and then go to share again.
Okay.
But there's a box to turn it on, or I think one of us might be able to take over.
I think you're probably more efficient with that, Amber, in terms of the sound.
Yeah.
Yep. Or we do have subtitles, so if that can do some of the work too.
That's fine. That's fine. Go ahead. There's subtitles right on the screen, so that's fine. Let's go ahead and just hit play.
Okay.
That's
and if
great.
we have a link, we could drop that in chat as well. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. All right, so you can see here that there's a group of teachers and we are outside of a school, and now they're heading inside the building. And they're greeting some folks that they run into, school employees in the hallway. And then here they are at a teacher kind of back to school meeting where they're talking with one another, and there's new colleagues and then there's veteran colleagues, teachers that have been there for many, many years. All right, well, I think that's good. We can go ahead and pause it there. All right, next slide, please.
Yeah. So these questions on the screen come from our Focus in Fair Use worksheet, which we'll share shortly, which we designed to help instructors walk through these guiding questions about fair use and their pedagogical goals. So if we keep the artifact and the project that Amber just discussed in mind, we're just going to give you a quick real world how she and I talk through things when we call each other on the phone. Is the original purpose being transformed?
Oh, and Will, there's going to be questions on here. Yeah, we'll just have to kind of click through it. Sorry. Yeah, so the original purpose of this film, right, was for entertainment. And now we are using it for a completely different purpose. We're using it to illustrate authentic French greetings. So I would answer yes.
Does the purpose of including this item serve more than a decorative purpose?
Yeah, so we include this question because sometimes we use things for fun at the beginning of class or to make our resources look more pretty, and they don't necessarily have a pedagogical purpose. But here, this clip clearly is serving a deeper purpose, and we have some really great reflection questions that are paired with it. So yes.
Could you recreate this item, or is there value in the authenticity it provides?
Oof, I think it would be quite challenging to recreate this. It takes place in a French school. It's spontaneous conversation. There's a really diverse population, people who have met each other, people who have never met each other, younger teachers, older teachers. So I really feel like this is one of the best clips that I could find to represent true, authentic greetings in a school setting.
Is the quantity that you've selected to include appropriate?
Yeah, well, we didn't get to see the whole clip. I hope that you did notice at the very beginning, we showed just a few seconds outside of the school to help establish kind of scene where we're at. And then we trim the clip at the end of the meeting. So we're very purposeful in terms of the quantity that we provide. We're not including the whole film because we're just focusing here on greetings.
If possible and where appropriate, has a range of items been selected?
Yeah, so this one doesn't necessarily apply to our particular example, but I think if I wanted to provide more examples of greetings and introductions, I would try to pull from different films, just to have a diversity, and also not just to rely on just the one title.
Have you made an effort to include the item from its primary source rather than an educational one?
So rather than pulling this from like a Teachers Pay Teacher website or something like that, we have pulled it from the original film. So yes.
Have you prepared an attribution to be included in your materials?
Absolutely. That's what Shannon just went over. We have that diagrammed, and we provided it right below the film clip.
And in this case, since Amber responded mostly yes, there's a strong case for including this film clip under fair use based on the code. So I know we've hinted at it a little bit. Here is the link to finding the full Focus in Fair Use worksheet, which we developed from our work in this cohort. From Amber and my perspective, it's a supplement to the code. It's a way to guide instructors through their thought process around inclusion under fair use. It's openly licensed, available at the link in chat. We encourage you to check it out, share it if it works for you. I know there was some conversation about kind of having that yes or no, you want something really clear. I think my big takeaway from working in this cohort is that that can't exist, because it's you and your pedagogical needs with your specific project. So you as an individual have to work through those questions, because you have to believe in the fair use rationale that you hold as the instructor. So that was kind of the space that Amber and I came from for this worksheet. And then we have a little bit of wrap up on the next slide and any time remaining for questions.
Yeah, so to sum things up, we thought we'd talk a little bit about our past, present, and looking forward, who we were before the code and who we are now. I think in the past that Shannon and I were, like so many of you have mentioned in the Q&A and in chat, really hesitant to include copyrighted materials under fair use. I did a lot of, hey, you should just include the link. The link is great. Or are you sure you can't find something openly licensed? Now we really feel like we are empowered to say, hey, let's look at the code. Here's some questions, and you can decide. And we have stopped reinventing the wheel. So I love the example that Will gives about the verb charts, because I work a lot with language faculty, and there's things like vocabulary lists, verb charts, things like that, that just like, if we were to sit down and 5 of us were to write up, what are school vocabulary words, or what are greetings and introductions, our lists are going to look pretty similar. And I think that that's been really nice, because it's really saved a lot of time and let us focus in on some of the more challenging pedagogical content. And at present time, we have a deeper understanding, and we feel like Mythbusters. So we love to talk about the 10%, the 30%, all of those different things, and really have a conversation about, hey, where did you hear that from? Why do you think that is? And is that really like the best answer? Sometimes it's going to be less than 30%, and sometimes it's going to be more than 30%, for example. And it just depends on your pedagogical use. And overall, we really feel like pretty passionate to empower teachers to layer all these different things together. So not just fair use, but things in the public domain, Creative Commons, and their own original content to make the best possible OER for their classroom and for their students.
Great, thank you so much. We're in question time, so I'm just going to say a lot of people are doing really cool stuff with this. I think we got the coolest one here today, but it's been really, really powerful to see in a lot of spaces. And I do want to leave the rest of the time for open discussion and questions. I've seen a couple of questions disappear, so Meredith, you or Shannon or Amber may have been hard at work answering them in the chat. Are there any lingering questions that you want to highlight, or do we want to invite other questions now? And I think you're muted, Meredith.
I'm muted. Someday I will not trip over that stair, but today is not that day. I was answering a question in the chat that was, do we have a newsletter? Which I appreciate I would like to subscribe to your newsletter method of expressing enthusiasm. We don't have a newsletter. We do have an email list that we use very poorly and infrequently. But one of the things I think Will and I were thinking about is, as sort of there's a push for subscription models and there's new technologies, there's a whole new fresh sort of round of questions about copyright and education and fair use and OER. And we're trying to think about how to do that in maybe a sort of regular drop-in chat with a notes doc circulated or something. So I'm going to put my email in the chat. And if you're interested or have an idea that you think will work, that's great. And we'll talk to the conference organizers about whether or not we can figure out how to do more work on this. The other thing I want to say, just as we close, is for a lot of folks, this is a really big change. And we wanted to acknowledge that even though we've been telling you that this is a very conservative legal change, it is a really huge radical practice change for a lot of people. And so I wanted to leave you with the acknowledgement that if this feels like we're telling you you can do a ton of stuff you've been told you absolutely cannot do, you're not wrong. It is a very safe legal area of practice, even though it is so, I think, boldly different than what the sort of norms have been. Well, Amber, Shannon, do you guys have a perspective on that?
I mean, I think it is a radical shift just for a mindset more than anything. And I think just being open to working through those questions. I think the big challenge is kind of what I was trying to hint at. There can't be a yes or no. There can't be a quick checklist. There can't be a quick answer, because in the event that, let's say I was a French teacher and I took what Amber just showed, and I'm teaching very differently in a very different context, and that video actually doesn't fit fair use for my pedagogical context and projects. If I were to revise her work, I need to think through that as an individual. And that's part of why Amber and I are so adamant about including attribution for fair use and pointing to the code and thinking through that, because it's works with the code for her specific instance and that specific project. And the way that she saw it pedagogically. If I were to redo that, it might not. And so I think that's the mindset challenge, because it's not necessarily harder, but it's things we think through all the time. We're just not as comfortable doing it with copyrighted material we're including in something openly. And I think that's the scary part, because it's not a yes or no.
That's a really good point. And I'll say I would bet it is less different than what some people do in the classroom when they sort of think nobody's watching. So some of this is just sort of coming out of the shadows and saying loud and proud, this is the best pedagogy. This serves my students best. And I'm not going to hope nobody notices. I'm going to be proud of the work that I'm doing.
And own that.
Yeah, I think at the beginning I was like, I just wish there was a magic 8-ball that I could just use and be like, is it fair use or not? But and I think just the challenge is reflecting on working with instructors. So we've had the opportunity to kind of pass this information on and pay it forward to some K through 12 teachers that we've worked with in other groups. And I think the media piece is probably like the biggest challenge. I think we're really comfortable with working with text for whatever reason. And so it does feel like a little bit of a jump, but just know that, if you work through the code, if you work through the focus on fair use worksheet that Shannon and I shared, you have a good case if you are being really intentional about what you're doing.
I think that intentional part is really important.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find the link here.